Guten Morgen, guten Tag, guten Abend. So today we are going to review everything that we have learned about nouns and pronouns. So everything, hopefully, that you would want to know that you need to refresh, that you may have forgotten about nouns and pronouns will be addressed here. We're not going to do every single little thing, but the big, important, broad things about nouns and pronouns we are going to review in this video. So, Nomen und Pronomen. So we started with the fact that nouns have gender in German, right? We have der, die, and das, which are masculine, feminine, and neuter. And so you have masculine, for example, der Vater, der Bruder, der Morgen. So of course, Vater and Bruder have gender, so that makes sense. But then der Morgen is the morning. And so all nouns have gender, even if they are just inanimate objects or concepts. And then we have a feminine, die Adresse, die Mutter, die Schwester. Some neuters, das Kind, das Alphabet, das Auto. And then all of them in the plural take die. So the plural article is die. So these are the definite articles. And then when you learn a new noun, typically you want to learn the gender of the noun, but you don't have to memorize it actively, but you do at least have to recognize the gender of the noun because it does make a difference in the translation sometimes. So you have, for example, die Mutter kommt zur Schule, we learned is nominative, it's the subject of the sentence, which is just the mother comes to the school. But at the very beginning, we didn't know what the dative was. So when you looked at something like die Lehrerin gibt der Mutter das Zeugnis, it looks like Mutter has suddenly become masculine or something, but it hasn't become masculine. It's still feminine, but that's what the feminine dative looks like. Feminine dative is der. So it has changed its article because it's changed its noun case, but it's helpful to know that Mutter is actually feminine, because what's happening is that when you know that Mutter is feminine and then you see der Mutter, you think, well, that's not right. It's not that it's not right, it's just not nominative, it's dative. And so when you know it's dative, you know it's going to be the indirect object, and that will make a difference in your translation, being able to understand what that sentence is doing, and that's the indirect object, so you can translate it correctly. It can help you identify what's the subject, what's the indirect object, what's the direct object. So knowing the genders will help you know what noun cases are happening. So those are genders, and then we had the beginning of how to identify the plurals of nouns. So there are lots of different ways to pluralize a noun in German. For example, das Buch would be listed in the dictionary with the umlaut and then the er suffix. So that means in the singular it's das Buch, and in the plural it's die Bücher. Das Buch, die Bücher. Another way is just for the feminine nouns that end in e, they're almost always you're going to add an n to make those plural. So die Karte becomes die Karten. And then if it ends in ung, it's always going to have that en suffix to make it plural. Die Vorlesung, die Vorlesungen. And then das Seminar just takes an e to make its plural. Die Seminare. Der Kurs takes an e as well. Der Kurs, die Kurse. Das Semester doesn't take any ending. So very often when a noun ends in er or el, it doesn't take any suffix to make it plural. So it's like the example we had, dear in English. One dear, two dear, das Semester, die Semester. So it's like ein Semester, zwei Semester. The only way you know that it's become plural is because of that article, die Semester. So if you know that it's actually neuter, das Semester, and then you say to yourself, when you see die Semester, you think, wait, semester isn't feminine, right? It helps you know that it's actually in the plural, die Semester, because in the singular it would be das Semester. And then der Student becomes die Studentin in the plural, and then die Studentin becomes die Studentinnen in the plural. Die Universität takes an en, Universitäten. So lots of different ways to make the plural, and you just have to get used to those as you go along. And then we have the definite versus the indefinite articles, right? So the definite article is the equivalent of the English the, das ist der Apfel, and then the indefinite article is the equivalent of the English ein. Ein is a or an in English, right? Yeah, ein, a or an. Das ist ein Apfel, this is an apple. So you could say, for example, das ist der Apfel, this is the apple. Das ist ein Apfel. This is an apple. Das ist die Banane. Das ist eine Banane. This is a banana, etc. For all of these are all the nominatives, right? Definite articles and indefinite articles in the nominative. And then, of course, to note in the plural, you can use the definite article, die Blumen. You can, of course, say the flowers, but you can't say a flowers because ein implies just one, right? A flower, a flowers, you can't do it. So when you want to have an indefinite situation with a plural, you actually just leave the article off and you just say Blumen. So you could say, for example, das sind die Blumen. These are the flowers. But if you just want to say these are flowers, you just leave it off like in English. Das sind Blumen. So often plural nouns don't have articles. So we can look at, ist das eine Banane? Is this a banana? Yeah, das ist eine Banane. It's feminine, so it's got that E on the end. Ist das ein Apfel? Nein, das ist kein Apfel. Das ist eine Banane. So then we introduced the negative indefinite article, which is kein, or with endings keine, whatever the ending is, right? So kein means not a or no. It's the negative form of the indefinite article. Ein, kein. All you do is put the K at the front. Ist das ein Apfel? Ja, das ist ein Apfel. That's positive. Ist das eine Banane? Nein, das ist keine Banane. Das ist ein Apfel. No, this is not a banana. This is no banana. Not a banana. So you see, it would be eine in the indefinite article. And so with the negative, it's keine, has that same ending. Matches the ending. Just has a K at the front. Ist das ein Auto? Ja, das ist ein Auto. It's neuter, right? Neuter nominative. Ist das ein Haus? Nein, das ist kein Haus. Das ist ein Auto. So not a house, it's neuter, so kein, with no ending on it, just kein. Ein Haus, kein Haus, same ending. Sind das Blumen? Now with the plural, a lot of times we're not going to have any article at all, but we can still do the negative, right? Because we can't say, are these a flowers? You can't say that. But you can say these are not flowers. You can certainly say that, right? So you can put the negative in. This one is, we're going to do positive. Ja, das sind Blumen. Yes, these are flowers. It's positive. But what about if we're going to do negative? So sind das Blumen? Are these flowers? We're going to say, nein, das sind keine Blumen. Das sind Autos. No, these are not flowers. So you can add in this keine because it's suddenly zero. Zero can be plural, but one cannot be plural, right? So not flowers as in no flowers. Yeah. Keine Blumen. So you just need to know in that case, you would add in, it has an E. It sort of matches the die keine. Yeah. So you need to know that it's keine, and the plural does have that keine form. And then, of course, my favorite example, das ist kein Mond, das ist eine Raumstation. That's no moon. That's a space station. Mond is masculine. That is not a moon. Yeah, and then you can watch this later if you want. It's just the scene where they say that. And then Luke says, seht mal, fliegt auf den kleinen Mond zu. And Han says, ich glaube, ich erwische ihn, bevor dort ist. Ist fast in Schussweite. And Obi-Wan says, das ist kein Mond. Das ist eine Raumstation. And then Han says, zu groß für eine Raumstation. So, that's no moon, not a moon, that's a space station. So you see how the indefinite articles and the definite articles and the negative indefinite articles all work. Okay, so then let's review nicht and kein a little bit. So of course we had kein or keine. It can any of those endings that the indefinite article can have. It can also have. It means no, not a, none, zero refers to zero, right? Negative. Because it's an article, it must be followed by a noun. It always comes before nouns. And then nicht, on the other hand, means not, and it can come before various things. It can negate verbs, it can negate adverbs, prepositional phrases, and it can negate nouns that have definite articles or no articles. It can't negate nouns that have indefinite articles, because that's what you need kein for. But nicht can negate nouns that have definite articles or no articles. So, for example, nicht, the main rule is nicht and ein always becomes kein. And nicht in einer always becomes keine, and all the different versions with the different endings. You never use nicht ein, it becomes kein. Those two together become kein. So we can look at these examples we had. Ist das eine Lampe? Nein, das ist keine Lampe. Is this a lamp? No, it's not a lamp. You wouldn't say nicht eine Lampe. You say keine Lampe, right? Finde ich Bücher hier? So now we've got no article, and then you can actually add the keine in here. Nein, Sie finden keine Bücher hier. Do I find books here? No, you find no books here. So you can put the keine before a plural with no article. Ist das mein Buch? Nein, das ist nicht dein Buch. Now we have a possessive, dein Buch, right? So possessive is going to be different from an indefinite article. It works in a similar way, but it's still, in this case, nicht is going to go before it. Because it's not nicht ein, it's nicht dein. So that's different. This is not your book. Das ist nicht dein Buch. Ist das der Lehrer? Nein, das ist nicht der Lehrer. So then you can have your nicht before before noun with a definite article, not the teacher. Imagine if it said, if you want to say this is not a teacher, nicht ein Lehrer, that would be wrong. It would have to be kein Lehrer. Ist das Buch alt? Nein, es ist nicht alt. Now we're going to negate that adjective, right? No, it is not old. Es ist nicht alt. With nicht. Okay, so now we get to our pronouns. These are kind of tricky sometimes. So these are nominative pronouns, the very first versions of the pronouns you learn. Ich, du, er, sie, es, wir, ihr, sie. And so we have ich is I, du for you, informal, er and sie, he and she. And then this one, and we also have es, meaning it. And then wir, we, and then ihr for you, informal. And then sie for they, and of course sie and sie with a capital S is then you formal for both singular and plural. So let's look at some verbs in the present tense to help us remember what we're doing with these pronouns in the nominative. So for example, wo wohnst du? Where do you live, right? Du wohnst. Wo wohnst du? You informal. Ich wohne in Anaheim, California. Ich is an I, right? And then we've got, wo wohnt Angela Merkel? Where does Angela Merkel live? And then sie wohnt. So we've taken Angela Merkel and replaced the full name with just the pronoun sie wohnt in Berlin. Sie wohnt in Berlin. So we've got to, of course, conjugate those verbs according to the subject. And when we do this, we can do it with pronouns, right? Ich wohne. Du wohnst, er, sie, es wohnt, wir wohnen, ihr wohnt, sie wohnen. And of course the big question is at the beginning, how do you know the difference between she and they and you formal? A big part of it is looking at the conjugation of the verb. So which pronoun are we going to use when we translate a sentence? Well, first we look at the conjugation. Wo wohnt sie? Has to be where does she live, right? Because if we look at the conjugation, wo wohnt sie, you see that sie wohnt, when you have sie in combination with this type of conjugation, the T, that means it has to be she, because the other ones are sie wohnen. So that has to be where does she live, wo wohnt sie, because of the conjugation. But then if you have wo wohnen sie, that en, you look over here, and that one has to be they. They live. Where do they live? Because we have that en conjugation on the verb, and that goes with sie for they. So where do they live? Wo wohnen sie? But what about if we have the capital S? Wo wohnen sie? That will be where do you formal live? So we can tell it's got the same conjugation as the one for they, but it has the capital S, so that's going to tell us it means you formal. Wo wohnen sie? So that's why it's important to memorize the conjugations, because that will tell you what that pronoun actually means. So you can correctly conjugate or correctly translate that pronoun. And then, of course, to remember our sein, to be, is a very important verb to have the conjugations memorized for. So, ich bin, du bist, er, sie, es ist, wir sind, ihr seid, sie sind. So this is present tense. I am, you are, he, she, it is, etc. So we've got all those conjugations. And then we can use that when we translate to make sure that we're getting the right pronoun. Wie alt ist sie? How old is she, right? We know that it can't be how old are they or how old are you because of the word ist. Sie ist. That's how you conjugate sie ist. If it were how old are they, it would be wie alt sind sie. That's conjugation. Sie sind, they are. Sie sind, wie alt sind sie, how old are they? And then if we had a capital S, wie alt sind sie, then you would know that it's actually the you formal because the capital S and sind, that's how you get to you formal are. So we can see that one is capital and one is not. So that's convenient enough. We'll do in a moment where sometimes there's just context, so we'll tell you between they and you formal. But for now, let's look at haben in the present tense. We have to remember how to conjugate haben in the present tense. Ich habe, du hast, er, sie, es hat, wir haben, ihr habt, sie haben, sie haben. So hopefully you remember that more or less. And then we can do the same thing. Sie hat eine Katze. So we think to ourselves, does this mean she has a cat or they have a cat or you have a cat? Because sie can mean all of those things. But since we've memorized a conjugation for haben, we know that it has to be she has. Sie hat. Because it says hat and not haben. So she has a cat. Sie hat eine Katze. And then sie haben eine Katze. Now what's happening is we've got this other conjugation, haben, because it's the beginning of the sentence. We don't know, that could be either you formal or they, because the beginning of the sentence is going to be capitalized no matter what. So it could be either sie haben or sie haben, they have or you have. So that one's going to be they have. And then it would be the exact same for you formal, have a cat. Sie haben eine Katze, sie haben eine Katze. So when sie begins a sentence, it's always capitalized. So you just have to know, you have to guess based on context whether this is going to be you or they formal. And also when you, in speech, when people say this out loud, you're not going to be able to hear it. So that would also have to be based on context. But the whole point of pronouns is that they replace nouns that have already been established in the conversation. So the context will be there because if the context weren't there, you'd be using a noun, not a pronoun. You don't use a pronoun the first time you introduce something, right? It's only you replace it after. So the context will be there to distinguish between those two. And then just to review articles with professions and nationalities. In English, you would say something like, I am a student, right? And that would be, ich bin Studentin. Sometimes, this is just a weird thing about articles, right? In German, when you talk about professions, nationalities, religions as well, you don't use that article like you would in English. So when you translate it, you got to add the article. Ich bin Studentin turns out to be, I am a student. David Hasselhoff ist Rocksänger, turns out to be David Hasselhoff is a rock singer. Sie ist Amerikanerin, turns out to be she is an American. And then ist Journalist becomes he is a journalist. Yeah. So let's get to here's the pronouns, the regular pronouns and the nominative again. Here we have the regular pronouns and nominative. And then just to review, what is the difference between du and ihr and sie? Du is singular informal. Use it for friends, children, classmates, and animals. Hans, wie alt bist du? Ich bin 13 Jahre alt. But then ihr is people that you would individually call du, but then together you call them ihr, plural, informal. Hans und Jutta, wie alt seid ihr? Wir sind 16 Jahre alt. And then sie is the formal for both singular and plural, all adults whom you don't know and people at their jobs. Frau Ruf, wie alt sind Sie? Ich bin 30 Jahre alt. Okay, so now we can look at that same principle for different verb tenses to let the conjugation tell us what the pronoun is saying, right? So we're going to do the simple past of sein, to be, in the simple past. So, wo warst du gestern Abend? Where were you last night? Warst du, du warst. Ich war zu Hause. Wo warst du gestern Abend? Where were you last night? I was at home. Ich war auch zu Hause. I was also at home. Wir bleiben zu Hause. Okay, so let's look at the conjugation of that. Ich war, I was. Ich war. Du warst, it takes an ending. It takes a conjugation, right? Er, sie, es war. Wir waren, ihr wart, sie waren, and sie waren. So in the simple past, this is an irregular. So the regulars and the irregulars of simple past are going to take different endings. This is an example of the irregular. So this will help us to distinguish what the pronoun means based on the fact that we have the conjugation memorized. So, sie war krank is she was sick. It has to be she was. It can't be they were or you were, because they were or you were is sie waren and sie waren. But sie war over here on the left-hand side has to be she was. Sie war krank. But if we had sie waren, it could be either they were sick or you formal were sick, just because it happens to be the first word of the sentence, so it happens to be capitalized. But if it weren't the first word of the sentence, then it would be obvious which one it was, either the you formal or they. Yeah. Okay, so we can do the same thing with the perfect, with the conversational past, the present perfect, so the other type of past. You could say, for example, hat sie schon gegessen? Did she eat already? The reason we can tell is that it's she is because it's sie hat, right? That's how you conjugate haben for sie. And what if you had haben sie schon gegessen? That would have to be did they eat already? Because sie haben, that's conjugation for they have, as opposed to she has. And then if it's a capital S, you can tell it means did you formal eat already? Haben Sie schon gegessen? You can also say have you eaten? Did you eat already, or have you eaten? Both are fine. You know how that goes with the perfect. We will do a big review of all of the verbs next. So of course we'll talk about verb conjugations in more detail. But right now we're just talking about verb conjugations as they can help us with pronouns, right? Okay, so with the perfect, of course, you can use either haben or sein as a helping verb depending on what the verb is, what the other verb is. So we need to remember our conjugation of sein to be. Sie ist nach Hause gegangen, which is she went home, she has gone home. So we have sie ist. It has to be she. It can't be they or you because sie ist, right? If it were they, it would be sie sind nach Hause gegangen. Or you formal would look the same just because it happens to be the beginning of the sentence. Sie sind nach Hause gegangen, you formal went home. So those verbs will help you tell what the pronouns really are. And then werden also is used to make different compound verb tenses, right? We were using haben and sein to make the perfect just now, and werden is used to make the future and the passive. So werden on its own just means to become. If it's just the only verb in the sentence, it's to become. But if you add it to infinitives, then it's the future. And if you add it to a past participle, then it's passive. So, ich werde, du wirst, er, sie, es wird. Wir werden, ihr werdet, sie werden, sie werden. So you can see we've got some vowel changes, du wirst, er, sie, es wird, and some quite strange endings. Du wirst, the D disappears, and then er, sie, es wird, it's sort of, and there's no ending on that one. It's very strange. So it's important. This is another one that's good to commit to memory because it will let you choose the right pronoun. Sie wird nach Hause gehen. So hopefully you can recognize that wird, a form of werden, plus the infinitive means future. She will go home. And the reason it's she will go home and not they will go home or you formal will go home is because sie wird is the conjugation on this left side, sie wird. But then sie werden and sie werden would be either they will go home or you formal will go home, just because it's the beginning of the sentence. If the word order were different, then you would be able to see the capitalization better. So the difference between sie wird and sie werden will then tell you what the pronoun is. We can try a passive. Sie wird bezahlt. So you see now we have the conjugated werden plus the past participle, and that's how you make the passive. She is paid or she is being paid. Bezahlt is a past participle. It might not look like a past participle because it's got that inseparable prefix at the front of it. But inseparable prefixes block the GE from being added when you make the past participle. So when we review the verb tenses, we will go over that again. But just to note, bezahlt is a past participle. So she is paid, she's being paid, versus sie werden bezahlt is they are being paid, and then also sie werden bezahlt, you formal are being paid. So that conjugation sie wird versus sie werden contains information that will help you translate. And then we can get to the accusative, right? So now we need to start adding our noun cases. Noun cases in German are nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. There are only 4 noun cases in German. It's pretty good compared to a lot of languages that have a lot more. So we have ich habe eine Schwester, I have a sister. We have the subject, which is ich, and then the verb habe, and then the direct object, eine Schwester. So the nominative, the subjects are always in the nominative, and direct objects are always in the accusative. How do you find the subject? Well, you look at the verb first, and you say, who does the action of the verb? Who has? That's ich. Ich is the subject because it does the action of the verb. And then the direct object receives the action of the verb. So I have what? Who or what is receiving the action of my having? Eine Schwester. The direct object you identify because it receives the action of the verb directly. So, ich habe einen Bruder, same thing. That would be the subject, ich, and then the verb. And then einen Bruder is the direct object. So the direct object is in the accusative. And then we can look at a different word order. So the verb is always going to be in the second position. But in this case, we're going to start the sentence with the adverb heute. Heute mache ich meine Hausaufgaben. And so our subject actually, we do an adverb first to emphasize it, and then we've got to do our verb because it's the second position. And then only now are we getting around to our subject, and then only after that do we get around to the direct object, which ends up being that you have the direct object immediately following the subject, which can happen sometimes. And then it's important to be able to distinguish which is which, because it can get a little confusing. But we will talk, and then in 2 days we will review all of the word order rules. And of course, the most basic word order rule in German is verb in the second position. So we will go over that more again later. So let's try another one. We have this adverb situation starting the sentence, and then the verb, morgen schreibe ich eine SMS. So the subject can actually come after the verb in a lot of cases. And then that's the direct object, subject's in the nominative, and the direct object's in the accusative. Verb in the second position. Okay, so the one way to recognize the accusative is that the masculine changes its articles. So instead of saying der Vater, you're saying den Vater. Instead of ein Vater, einen Vater. But the masculine is the only one that changes when you go from the nominative to the accusative. All the others stay the same. So let's look at ich kaufe den Pullover. I buy the sweater. Subject, verb, direct object. That's like the most straightforward word order. But sometimes you want to emphasize the direct object, like to correct someone or to just emphasize it, to put the focus on it, right? So you could say den Pullover kaufe ich, which in English it's not common at all to start the sentence with the direct object, but in German it's very common. It's happens all the time to start the sentence with the direct object, and so it's helpful to be able to recognize the form of that article. Den Pullover is obviously going to be the direct object because you can see how it's in the accusative. Den Pullover, not der Pullover. So then we have, for example, these sentences where you can actually switch them around, and they end up being the same word, but with the same exact words, but with different word order. And you can use that to emphasize the direct object. Der Hund beißt den Mann, subject, verb, direct object, nominative, and then accusative, right? That's the simplest word order. But what if we want to emphasize den Mann? Den Mann beißt der Hund. And then you have, it looks like in English, the man bites the dog, but it doesn't really mean that. Because in English we use word order to to say what's the subject and what's the direct object, right? But in German, they use noun cases to do that. It's not, the word order isn't a reliable predictor of that. So it actually is the same sentence. It's still the dog bites the man, but it looks like the man bites the dog. But since you can recognize an accusative, you know that the man's actually a direct object. So you can see how der Hund beißt den Mann beißt der Hund. It's the same words because it's the same articles, so it means the same thing. The dog bites the man. But then, der Mann beißt den Hund beißt der Mann. Now we have the opposite situation because now you can see the dog is the direct object. So now the dog receives the biting and the man does the biting. So with the masculine, it's super easy to see what's going on here. With the feminine, you would need to just tell based on context. But Germans are so used to starting the sentence with the direct object that it wouldn't throw them for a loop too much, even if it were feminine. And it's also a question of intonation, right? You would say, so this first one is, der Hund beißt den Mann. But then the second one is, den Mann beißt der Hund. So there's actually a vocal emphasis as well. But of course you can't, in writing, that wouldn't be... you wouldn't be able to hear that, but you just have to tell based on context. And of course, the other way to tell is that even if this were feminine, like die Frau beißt der Hund, the reason, if it said die Frau beißt der Hund, the reason you'll be able to tell that die Frau is actually the direct object is because der Hund is so obviously in the nominative. And so that has to be the subject. So die Frau can't be the subject. If you find something else that's obviously the subject, then you know that the other one's going to be the direct object. Yeah. So let's review the predicate nouns because these can certainly be tricky. Ich habe eine Katze. So that's a direct object, just like we have been looking at. But sie ist Amerikanerin is not a direct object. That's a predicate noun. Prädikatsnomen, predicate noun. So let's try this one. Ich trinke einen Kaffee. I drink a coffee. That's a direct object, just like we've been doing, right? So sometimes we get a predicate noun. Sometimes we get a direct object. This one is going to be a predicate noun. Sie wird Journalistin. She is becoming a journalist, predicate noun. So the way you identify predicate nouns is that the verb is either sein, werden, or bleiben. To be, to become, or to stay / remain. And basically the reason those are predicate nouns is because they're saying A equals A. The first one refers back to the same person. So they refer to the same thing. There's no action from one to the other. It's just A equals A. This is this. So a common way for this to happen is when you say das ist. This is something, right? So you say das ist der Mann. This is the man, or that is the man. So it's important to know that it's a predicate noun because predicate nouns are not in the accusative, they're in the nominative. So you end up with sentences that are structured nominative, verb, nominative, instead of nominative, verb, accusative, like you might expect. Das ist der Mann. It's not das ist den Mann, it's das ist der Mann. So both nominative. Or das ist der Student. This is the student. So both nominative. Yeah. We can compare these two. Ich habe einen Hund versus mein bester Freund ist ein Hund. So see einen Hund, that's in the accusative because it's a direct object. It's not, so you can see we have to have that ending einen Hund. It's the accusative. But the second one, mein bester Freund ist ein Hund, it doesn't have that ending because it's in the nominative. It's a predicate noun. What about ich bringe den Computer versus das ist der Computer? See that one on the left, ich bringe den Computer, that's a direct object, so it's in the accusative. But on the right, das ist der Computer, it's not a direct object, it's a predicate noun, so it's in the nominative. Den is in the accusative, but der is in the nominative. Okay, so then also, to wrap up the accusative, we have to talk about the question words, wer and wen. So, wer besucht meine Oma? Who visits my grandma? That's the subject of the sentence. Like, who does the visiting? Who does the visiting, right? And then the direct object is the grandma. Someone visits my grandma. My grandma receives the visiting. So wer is the subject, it's in the nominative case. But then wen besucht meine Oma? Whom does my grandma visit? Now my grandma is actually the subject. She does the visiting. And then wen is the direct object because that person receives the visiting. So that's the accusative version. Wen is the accusative form of who, right? So whom. So wer besucht meine Oma? Who visits my grandma? Wen besucht meine Oma? Whom does my grandma visit? So the nominative for subjects is wer, and the accusative for direct objects is wen. So you can see how wer looks like der, wer and der, because they're both nominative. They sort of match. And see how accusative wen looks like den. So those are both the accusative, both used for direct object, wen and den. Okay, so ich trinke einen Kaffee, that's a subject, verb, direct object, nominative, accusative, right? Ich habe einen Stuhl, subject, verb, direct object, nominative, accusative. So to review, we have our nominative, which we have been using for subjects and predicate nouns. We have our accusative, which we use for direct objects. And then, just to note the articles and some pronouns here, we got to watch out for den and einen, and then ihn. We'll do the pronouns more thoroughly in a moment. And then to review the predicate nouns, we have ich esse eine Banane, I eat a banana, direct object, right? Das ist der neue Student. This is the new student. That's a predicate noun. Different situation. And then we get to the third noun case in German, which is dative. So we just did nominative and then accusative, and now we get to dative. And we have sentences that have accusatives, and then we can add datives into them. So, ich habe eine Orange is subject, direct object, nominative, accusative, right? But then we can use that same, we can add in an indirect object in order to give more information, right? And our indirect object is going to be in the dative, and it is ich gebe der Frau eine Orange. So we use the dative to indicate indirect objects. Ich gebe dem Mann eine Orange. That's going to be the indirect object, dem Mann, in the dative. Ich gebe dem Mann eine Orange. I give the man an orange. Ich gebe dem Kind eine Orange. I give the child an orange. Same thing, but with a neuter. So we use the nominative for subjects, predicate nouns. We use the accusative for direct objects, and we use the dative for indirect objects. So let's try some of these examples. Die Kellnerin bringt dem Gast das Essen. What's the subject? The server. So the server brings the guest the food, or brings the food to the guest. The subject is die Kellnerin. What's the direct object? That is das Essen. She brings what? What is the direct recipient of the bringing action? She brings what? She brings the food. And then what is the indirect object? What's in the dative? That's dem Gast. So the guest indirectly receives the action of the bringing. Dem Gast. What about der Kellner bringt dem Gast den Wein? The server brings the guest the wine, and so we're going to say, what's the subject, right? It is der Kellner. That's the subject. What's the direct object in the accusative? Den Wein. That is in the accusative, you can see. And then what's the indirect object in the dative? Dem Gast. It is the guest is indirectly receiving the action. And then we have a little summary of some articles, right? So dem Vater, einem Vater, der Mutter, einer Mutter, dem Kind, einem Kind, and then the dative plural, den Kindern. So it's important to be able to recognize all of these different articles because they will tell you if they will indicate this is an indirect object, and so that will change how you translate things. Of course, we had the situation where Sylvia buys the chocolate for the child. Sylvia kauft dem Kind die Schokolade. So that Sylvia buys the child the chocolate, or maybe Sylvia buys the chocolate for the child. The child is indirectly receiving the action of the buying. The child is not being bought directly. The chocolate is being bought directly. The child is indirectly receiving the buying action. But if the child were directly receiving the buying action, it would be Sylvia kauft das Kind. That would be an accusative version. Or this other situation, was macht Herr Ruf? What is he doing? Herr Ruf is cooking the food for the family, or Mr. Ruf cooks the family the food or the meal. So, Herr Ruf kocht der Familie das Essen, which is, you can see, family, die Familie is feminine, but now we want it in dative, so it's going to be der Familie. Versus, if we wanted it to be accusative, it would be Herr Ruf kocht die Familie. That is feminine accusative, and that's a very different situation when the family directly receives the cooking instead of indirectly receives the cooking. Okay, so, and then we had some important verbs with dative objects. For example, schmeckt dir Ananas auf Pizza? So schmecken always takes that dative object. Tastes good to you. Ja, das schmeckt mir. Here we have Ananas auf Pizza. Nein, das schmeckt mir nicht. Gehören is a common one, to belong to plus the dative, right? So der Kartoffelsalat gehört mir, der Wein gehört mir nicht, die Tomaten gehören mir. So gehören plus dative. And then gefallen is a pretty tricky verb. It means to be pleasing someone, to appeal to someone, but when you translate it, sometimes you just want to say you like it, but then you have to switch the subject versus object. So, dein Pullover gefällt mir. You could translate it very literally as your sweater is pleasing to me, or maybe your sweater appeals to me. So you see that the sweater, dein Pullover, is actually the subject of the sentence, and then we've got a dative coming after it. But maybe a better translation is I like your sweater, but what's happening is you have to switch that dative over to the subject of the sentence, and then switch that subject into a direct object in English, right? So that's a pretty tricky one. Also, notably, when we review the all of the verb situations, gefallen also takes a vowel change in the present tense. So stem vowel changing in the present tense, gefällt is different from gefallen, right? So that is a pretty strange verb. And notably, we also have helfen. Helfen is to help, and it takes a dative object as well. Okay, so der Genitiv. Now here's the fourth noun case in German. We've got nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. Genitive's the fourth one. So we have, for example, Aschenputtel geht auf das Schloss des Königs. Cinderella goes to the castle of the king, or the king's castle. You can say either way. Of the king or the king's castle. Des Königs. Or maybe sie geht zum Fest des Königs. She goes to the festival of the king, or maybe the king's festival. Zum Fest des Königs. So des Königs is in the genitive. Das ist das Schloss des Königs. This is the castle of the king, or maybe this is the king's castle. Das ist Aschenputtels Schloss. So this is Cinderella's castle. When you have someone's name, like their actual name, you can just put an S on the end, and that's a form of the genitive. Like, for example, you could say Katja's Freund, which is Katja's boyfriend. And so her name is Katja, and we've literally just put an S on the end, and that's all. And that makes it possessive, and genitive is possessive in a sense, right? In English, we put an apostrophe S there, but in German, it's just the S, no apostrophe. Michael's Katze, Michael's cat, right? And so this only works with people's actual names. If it's a normal noun, you can't do that. It's tempting to say der Königs Schloss, just add an S, because it's like the king's castle, right? But you can't do that. That's incorrect. You have to, if it's a regular noun, you have to use the actual genitive construction, das Schloss des Königs, which is parallel to the castle of the king. Okay, so we have das Auto des Vaters, the father's car, or maybe the car of the father. It's a possession relationship. Am Ende der Straße, at the end of the street. So, or maybe the street's end. You can see how it's not literal possession in the conventional sense, but you can see there's that relationship happening. So, am Ende der Straße, at the end of the street. or at the street's end, you could say. Galaxy's edge, maybe. Am Ende der Galaxie, right? It's actually what is this? Am Rand der Galaxie. That would be Galaxy's edge. Yeah. Okay. So von and dative use this are used sometimes to express the same idea, but it sounds more casual. So you could say das Auto von meinem Vater. Von always uses dative, which we'll go over the prepositions and the noun cases in just a moment. But das Auto von meinem Vater and am Ende von der Straße. So that expresses the same idea, but it's more casual. So how do we make the genitive? We have des Mannes and der Frau and des Kindes and der Kinder for the definite articles. Then we have eines Mannes, einer Frau, and eines Kindes for the neuter, and then plural, you can't do an indefinite article. So masculine and neuter articles are des or eines. Feminine and plural articles for genitive are der and einer. And then for masculine and neuter, they also take an es or an s at the end of the noun itself. And it's very tempting when you're translating to think that this is plural, because in English we make plurals with s's, but in German you very seldom make a plural with an s. Normally you're making a plural with an n or an e or an umlaut or maybe with nothing. But the s means genitive, it means possessive, not plural. So we need to look at when we add the masculine and the neuter nouns, when we add these s's to them, if the noun is only one syllable or it ends in an s sound, s, set, t, and sh, then you add an es. For example, der Mann in the nominative becomes des Mannes in the genitive. And then we have der Tag becomes des Tages in the genitive, of the day, des Tages. Suppe des Tages, soup of the day, right? And then der Spielplatz would become des Spielplatzes, and it takes the es because it's got the s sound at the end. But if it is more than one syllable, then you just add an s. So that is, for example, König is two syllables, so des Königs, just one s. Der Professor becomes des Professors. Mein Professor becomes meines Professors. We'll see the possessive takes that same ending as the indefinite article, which we will go over in just a moment. Okay, so the genitive articles des, der can be translated roughly as of the. Der Name des Künstlers, the name of the artist or the artist's name. Das Werkzeug des Arbeiters, the worker's tool or the tool of the worker. Die Bewegung der Erde, movement of the earth or the earth's movement. Das Jahr der Frau, die Farbe des Hauses. Die Macht der Kirchen, der Einfluss der Kirche. So these two right here, die Macht der Kirchen and der Einfluss der Kirche, this is a very subtle situation. See how churches versus just church? It's because Kirche is in the singular, Kirche, it's feminine, but then it takes that in for that's actually the plural ending. So because the feminine and the plural both take der in the genitive, that article isn't going to tell you necessarily. The article is telling you that it's either feminine or plural, and you need to look at that ending of the noun itself to tell you whether it's plural. So, die Meinung der Leute, people's opinion, opinion of the people, and then die Stimme des Volkes, voice of the people. Okay, and of course we had all of these horror film titles that are very commonly constructed with genitives, right? So, das Schweigen der Lämmer, the silence of the lambs. We have won the Academy Award in 1991, I believe. And we have, so das Lamm, die Lämmer, des Lammes, der Lämmer. So, das Lamm is singular nominative. And then die Lämmer is, of course, the plural. It's a neuter. It takes an umlaut and an er. That's its plural formation. But then in the genitive, if we took das Lamm and into the singular genitive, it would be des Lammes, of the lamb, singular. But what we want here is of the lambs, plural. So we're going to take der, that's our plural genitive, and then also the way the plural is formed, Lämmer. Das Schweigen der Lämmer, the silence of the lambs. Okay, then we have Tanz der Teufel. So that's Dance of the Devils. The English title is Evil Dead, but the German title is The Dance of the Devils. And so der Teufel is singular, nominative. Der Teufel is masculine, singular. And then die Teufel is then plural. It doesn't, these masculine nouns often, they don't take anything to be pluralized. So die Teufel is nominative plural. But what if we want to make genitives? We want to say of the devil or of the devils. So if we want to say of the devil, that is des Teufels, singular, of the devil. Des Teufels, it's like des Mannes. But what if we want it to be plural of the devils? Well, the plural form of Teufel is actually just Teufel. You don't add anything. The plural form is Teufel. But we want to make it a genitive plural, so we change that article to be the genitive plural article, which is der Kinder, der Teufel. So that's how we get Dance of the Devils. And then it could be demons as well, Dance of the Demons over the Devils. And then we have, for example, Die Nacht der lebenden Toten. So der Tote is the dead person. Die Toten is the dead people. But then we're going to take it into the genitive. So der Tote is masculine, the dead person. And then des Toten is going to be the genitive version with des. And this is actually, it doesn't take that S ending you would expect on the end of a noun because it's a noun that's been made out of an adjective, so it takes actually its adjective ending, which we went over at some point when we did adjectives, and we can review again as well. But just to note, it would be normally des Totes or something, but it's not because it's actually from the adjective tot, so it takes the adjective ending because it's a noun that's been made out of an adjective. But the operative thing here is the articles, des Toten, of the dead person. But what about the plural of the dead people, der Toten? So that's what we have here. Die Nacht der lebenden Toten, the night of the living dead. Okay, das Pendel des Todes is the pendulum of death. I think in English it was called the pit and the pendulum, but they changed it slightly to the pendulum of death. So the word death, der Tod, is masculine, der Tod. And then the plural would be die Tode, right? And then the genitive, it would be des Todes, of death. So we have the pendulum of death is das Pendel des Todes, des Mannes, des Todes. Okay, so the genitive is also used to talk about indefinite time phrases. Eines Tages could be either in the past or in the future. One day I would like to do this, or someday, or you could say one day I woke up in this. So it could be any indefinite time. Eines Tages, eines Abends, one evening something happened, or one evening I would like to do this. Eines Morgens, one morning. Eines Nachts, any of those. This is a very short. So eines Tages, that's the normal genitive construction. Eines Abends, eines Morgens, those are all how you would expect the genitive form. Eines Nachts is weird because Nacht is actually feminine, so it's kind of wrong, but it just ends up being that way. So it's like a wrong construction, but it caught on and people kept saying it. Okay, so of course you have to have the question word for all of these noun cases. We had wer and wen, and then wem for the dative, and then wessen is going to be for our genitive. Whose. So you can say, wessen Auto ist das? Whose car is that? Das ist das Auto der Studentin. That is the student's car. So when you say wessen, that means whose, the genitive. And then, of course, the answer to replace it will be in the genitive. Das Auto der Studentin, feminine genitive. The car of the student or the student's car. Wessen Fahrrad ist das? Whose bicycle is that? And then you can reply with a genitive. Das ist das Fahrrad meines Bruders. That's my brother's bicycle of my brother. And so then we want to look at these plurals again, right? Because it's very tricky to, when you look at a genitive and you think it's actually a plural, because we got all these S's here. Meines Bruders, Bruders, it looks like a plural or something, but it's really not. So just to review what the how plurals are actually formed in German, let's look at der Verfasser. It means the author, it's masculine, der Verfasser. In the plural, it's die Verfasser. So there's no change to make that plural and just like a dash. And so it's only the article. Der becomes die. The article is telling you it's now plural. What about der Mantel? Its change happens to be an umlaut added. So you go from der Mantel to die Mäntel. So of course you change the article like you always do, and then it happens to have that change. So you add the umlaut. And then we have all these other ways. So the E, the umlaut plus an E, or all the different combinations. And it's only in words of foreign origin, like das Auto, that then take an S. But all the others have all the different endings that are not S's to make plural. Yeah. Okay, so we have these, again, all of these more examples of all of the different ways. It's not even all the different ways, but it's the most common patterns to make the plural. Yeah, so one tricky thing about plurals is that there is a class, there's a category of masculine nouns that have a very strange thing going on with their singulars and plurals. So they're called in nouns, maybe you remember from a while back. So let's look at, in Bern gibt es einen Bärenpark. In Bern, there's a bear park. Das ist der Bär, das ist ein Bär. Those are both in the nominative. So der Bär, that's the word, der Bär. Ein Bär, right? But what about ich sehe einen Bären, I see a bear? It looks all of a sudden like we started being, it looks like we pluralized it. Bär, Bären, because what do we have here? Like en, der Student, die Studentin, it's die Vorlesungen, die Vorlesungen. This en is a common plural ending, right? So it looks like it's plural, but it's not plural anymore. The article tells you that, because einen, that's not plural, that's singular, right? So it's the reason we have that en ending is because it's now in the accusative. These n nouns in Nomen are nouns that take extra n's or ens anytime they're not in the nominative. So if you're in any other case, like the accusative and dative and genitive, they're going to all of a sudden have these extra n's on them. So der Student heißt Klaus, the student is named Klaus. Ich kenne den Studenten, I know this student. It looks like the plural, it's actually identical. Studenten, that is the plural, right? But the article, den Studenten, den is the singular, not the plural. If it said ich kenne die Studenten, then it would be plural, die, right? But it's not den, it's not die Studentin, it's den Studenten, and so it's still singular. Der Name ist Schmidt. Schreiben Sie bitte den Namen. So now the reason we have this n here is not because it's plural, it's still singular. The n is there because it's in the accusative now, and Name is just one of those nouns that takes those n's when it's not in the nominative anymore. Der Journalist schreibt einen Bericht. Any noun that ends in ist is going to take this pattern as well. Ich kenne den Journalisten. I know the journalist. It's the same as the plural form. If you said ich kenne die Journalistin, it would be that would be I know the journalists. That would be the plural, and it's only the article that's telling you that it's actually singular. So they look plural, but they're not plural. They add an n or an en because they're n nouns, and that is what n nouns do in the accusative, dative, and the genitive. So we can look at singular. Der Bär ist braun, nominative, right? Der Bär. It doesn't have an n. It's just Bär. But then when we put it into the accusative, we want that extra en. So do you see the bear? Siehst du den Bären? Accusative. But let's compare the plural. If it were plural, it would be die Bären sind schwarz. The bears in the nominative, it has the plural ending. It's a nominative and it's plural, so it's got a plural ending. But what about in the accusative? Siehst du die Bären? That's the accusative. So it's got that. Bären and Bären, they both have that same ending. It looks plural in both cases, but siehst du den Bären is singular and siehst du die Bären is plural. So there are lots of these. For example, Mensch is a very common one that takes it's one of the most common nouns of all, and it happens to be an n noun as well. And then Student. And so when you see them in the dictionary, they're going to have that extra en listed there. Affe, Bär, Bauer, Elefant. So people and animals, and they're all masculine. So except for Herz, which is neuter, but all the others are masculine. and they are masculine people, and then animals that happen to be masculine. And then there are these suffixes, intendant, repräsentant, any of the ant ones, and then ist, Komponist, Journalist, Sozialist, any of those. And then ent, anytime it ends in ent, it's gonna be one of those. So, kennen Sie den Journalisten dort? It looks plural, but it's actually singular. It's actually in the accusative, right? Kennen Sie den Experten dort? The nominative would be der Experte, but the accusative is den Experten. Ich gebe dem Kunden das Formular. So up until now, we've just been doing accusative, direct objects, but let's look at a dative, indirect object. So the nominative of this client, right? The client is der Kunde. It actually ends in an E. But in the dative, we're going to change our article like you always do in the dative, dem. And then we're actually going to add that in, not because it's plural, but because it's an N noun and we're going into any other case besides the nominative. We're going into the dative. So, ich gebe dem Kunden das Formular. I give the client the form. Das ist der Aufsatz des Studenten. This is the essay of the student. And so you can see now we're going into the genitive. And normally in the genitive, we would add an S to the end of the noun itself, right? But we're not going to add an S because this is an N noun, and the N noun rule overrides the genitive rule. So we're going to do the genitive in the article, des. The article is definitely showing genitive, right? But we're not going to add the S like we normally would to the end of the noun itself. We're going to add the N or the EN instead. And then, wurde als Idealisten gesehen. In this case, we don't have an article. Remember how we said with professions and nationalities, religions, in this case, ideologies, I guess, you leave off the article sometimes. So the article is left off, but we're still going to do the N noun thing here. And it looks very plural, Idealisten, right? Especially because you don't see the article. But it's actually singular because it's like he was seen as. That's the direct object, right? Okay, and then we have ich treffe den Fotografen. I'm meeting the photographer. So der Fotograf is normally with the ending like that. Fotograf, photograph. It's the photograph, and not the photographer, right? So photographer is der Fotograf, and then because we're in the accusative, because it's the direct object, it's got the en. Okay. Now we're going back to our indefinite articles. You see we have them in all the different cases, nominative, accusative, dative, genitive. And we want to get to our possessives because the possessives are tricky for, they're something you have to keep coming back to hopefully they become more and more clear as you go along. So we have the negative indefinite articles. We had all these, right? Ein can become kein, and here's the regular pronouns, but then here are the possessive pronouns. So the difference between regular pronouns, ich, du, er, sie, es, wir, ihr, sie, those are normal pronouns. I, you, he, she, it, just pronouns. But these are possessive pronouns. Mein, dein, sein, ihr, my, your, his, her, our, y'all's, their. Possessive pronouns are different than regular pronouns. And they are sometimes called limiting adjectives, but basically they come before a noun, right? So you have to say mein something, mein Haus, meine Katze, right? Mein something. So mein, dein, and then sein for his or its, and then ihr, meaning her, belonging to her, and then unser, belonging to us, our, euer, belonging to y'all, and then ihr is then their, belonging to them, and then ihr with a big S, your. So the tricky thing here is that you have to notice that there is some overlap. Look at the regular pronouns. This is just I, you, he, she, it. So ihr means y'all, you guys. But then in the possessive pronouns, ihr means either her or their. So it is, this is a very different situation. Ihr meaning y'all versus ihr meaning belonging to her or belonging to them. So just note that. That's going to be a tricky thing, right? But you can tell the difference between regular pronouns and possessive pronouns is because possessive pronouns have things that follow them, right? So it's like mein Apfel. It's not just, it needs a noun to follow it. It's not just like when you say ich is just ich, right? I. But then mein Apfel, mine, whatever it is. So with a regular pronoun, it's just going to be like maybe the subject of the sentence, ihr. But then with the possessive pronoun, it's going to be like ihr Apfel, her apple. It's going to have a noun following after. So they're used differently in sentences, so you should be able to tell which is which, right? Okay, so notice that the possessive pronouns have all the same endings as the indefinite articles. So if you had ein Apfel, it would become mein Apfel. You have eine Banane, becomes meine Banane. It has that same ending. And then with the plural, you can't have eine Blumen, because that would be like one flowers, which doesn't make sense. But you can't have my flowers, so that would be meine Blumen. So that's the article you need there, or the possessive you need there. Yeah. So here we have some examples. You can have all the different versions. So mein Vater is masculine, right? Mein refers to me. That could be a person of any gender. But then Vater is masculine, so that is going to be the ending, mein Vater. Meine Mutter is feminine. The reason the E is on there is because Mutter is feminine. Mein Kind for the neuter, meine Kinder for the plural. So the feminine and, this is all nominative, right? The feminine and the plural are getting that extra E on there because they match whatever comes next. Dein Vater, deine Mutter, dein Kind, deine Kinder, which would be then your father, your mother, your child, your children. And then sein Vater, seine Mutter, sein Kind, seine Kinder, his father, his father, his mother, his child, his children. One tricky thing here, as well, is that sein is also a verb that means to be, but it's used very differently. This is a possessive, it's going to have the noun coming after it. So just note that sein means his in this context, but in other contexts may mean the verb to be. And then ihr Vater, ihre Mutter, ihr Kind, ihre Kinder, that's referring to this one, she, right? So her father, her mother, her child, her children. And then unser Vater, unsere Mutter, unser Kind, unsere Kinder. Our father, our mother, our child, our children. And it's got the corresponding endings. And then euer Vater would be y'all's father. Eure Mutter would be y'all's mother. You do add the E, like we're always adding the E's, right? For the feminine and the plural. But when you do that on euer, the E in the middle disappears. It's far too many vowels for a German word. So eure, you add the E, but then the E in the middle disappears. Euer Kind, so is y'all's child. And then eure Kinder, y'all's children. Ihr Vater is then your, it would be their father. It looks identical. It could be either her father or their father. It's identical. So just based on context, you'll have to be able to tell. Ihr Vater, her father or their father. Ihre Mutter, her or their mother. Ihr Kind, her or their child. Ihre Kinder. Ihr Vater with a capital I is always going to be you formal. So your father, your mother, your child, your children, ihre Kinder. Yeah. Okay, so these were all in the nominative, right? But it can be in any noun case. So let's look at, for example, them listed out for the dative. So the masculine, der Vater in the nominative, den Vater in the accusative, and then dem Vater in the dative. And then those are all the definite articles. And now let's look at the indefinite article, einem, right? Einem Vater, indefinite article for dative, masculine. And then let's look at all of the possessives, meinem Vater, deinem Vater, ihrem Vater, seinem Vater, ihrem Vater, unserem Vater, eurem Vater. So they take all the same endings that the ein does. So with mein and dein and sein, those all rhyme with the word ein, mein, dein, sein. They all rhyme, so you can see it's very clear that they're taking the same ending. But then with ihr and unser and euer, they don't rhyme, so it's not quite as obvious, but they're still taking that same ending. And then for the neuter, it's the same ending all the way down. For the feminine, our feminine dative would be der Mutter for the definite article. And then for the indefinite article, feminine dative would be einer Mutter. And see that ER ending on the end of the ein is going to be the same ending we want for all the possessives. Meiner Mutter, deiner Mutter, ihrer Mutter, seiner Mutter, ihrer Mutter, unsere Mutter, eure Mutter. And then for the plural, what we're going to want for the dative is den Freunden, dative plural. And then keinen Freunden, meinen Freunden, deinen Freunden. We're going to want that same en ending all the way down for the plural dative as well. And so you can see this is going to work for every noun case, nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. So we were just looking at some dative ones. And then let's look at some genitives, for example. Eines Vaters, that's just the normal way to make the genitive for masculine with the indefinite article. But then we want to do possessive instead of indefinite article. And all you do is you use that same ending. Meines, eines Vaters, meines Vaters. Same thing. Einer Mutter, meiner Mutter. Eines Kindes, meines Kindes. And then you can't do the indefinite article for a plural, but you can do a possessive, so it's meiner Kinder for the genitive plural. Yeah. Okay, so let's just look at how these are constructed again. Sie hat ihren Apfel. The first part, she has her apple, right? The first part of the possessive pronoun matches the person who possesses. And then, so sie and ihr, she and her, they go together, right? But then the second part, the ending is determined by the noun that comes after. So Apfel is masculine, and here it's the direct object. So we're going to want our masculine accusative ending. Sie hat ihren Apfel. So we have einen, the masculine accusative, einen, meinen. So that's where we're getting this en ending. We want masculine accusative for that because Apfel is masculine and it's being used as a direct object, so it is the accusative. Ich besuche meinen Onkel, so ich and mine go together, I and my, right? But then the reason we have that en ending is because Onkel is masculine and it's being used as a direct object. We want masculine accusative ending, same as that one, einen, meinen. And then we have besucht seine Tante, so and sein, they go together, he and his, right? But then Tante is feminine, so we're going to want that feminine, it's accusative as well. So it will be our feminine, eine Tante, seine Tante. That's where we're getting that E ending on that one. And then we have, wir lesen unserem Kind eine Geschichte. We read our child a story. So now we're in the dative because it's like we read a story to our child. It's the indirect object. And so wir and unser go together. But what ending do we want? Well, we want the ending that goes for the dative because this is the indirect object. So we want our dative neuter, dem Kind, einem Kind, meinem Kind. So that em is the ending we want for all the possessives. And so we put that on the unser. Wir lesen unserem Kind eine Geschichte. Sie schreibt ihrem Freund einen Brief. So now sie and ihr go together, she and her. She writes her friend a letter. So the reason we have ihrem Freund is because Freund is masculine and it's in the dative. Sie gibt ihrer Freundin ein Geschenk. So now we have a very similar one, except for Freundin is feminine. She gives her female friend a present, or maybe she gives her girlfriend a present. And so then we have the ending has to match the dative feminine thing that comes next. Dative feminine. Einer, meiner. So then, of course, ihrer. And then ich schenke meiner Mutter Opernkarten. So ich and mine go together, but then we get that er for the same reason, feminine dative. I give my mother opera tickets. Okay, so you can see that summary again. They always match. And then this one again. So these are pronouns in the nominative. And then these are pronouns, the nominative again. But of course, we need to remember what our pronouns are in the accusative and the dative. So we were just talking about possessive pronouns. Those are pretty tricky, right? Now we're talking about regular pronouns again. Ich, du, er, sie, es, regular pronouns. And then those are in the nominative, regular pronouns. We also have our regular pronouns in the accusative and in the dative and in the genitive. So we have to refresh what those are. So ich in the accusative becomes mich, right? The difference between saying I and me, like I am going out, or do you see me, right? Of course, the direct object's going to be different form. So ich and mich, du becomes dich, er becomes ihn, sie stays the same, sie, es stays es, wir becomes uns, ihr becomes euch, sie stays sie, and sie stays sie for the little, for they. And then the dative has slightly different ones as well. Mir, dir, ihm, so to him or for him, ihr, to her or for her. And then es, meaning it, would be ihm, and then uns, us, and then euch, ihnen, and ihnen. So these are quite different pronouns. You have to remember how they all work. So we can replace nouns with pronouns in order to see how these pronouns work. Der Kellner bringt dem Gast die Apfelschorle. The server brings the guest the apple spritzer, Apfelschorle. So we want to replace dem Gast, which is masculine and in the dative, with a pronoun. So that would be the server brings him the Apfelschorle. So dem Gast becomes ihm. It is masculine and in the dative. That's why masculine and dative. So we have like this one right here, masculine dative. Er becomes ihm. And then der Kellner bringt sie dem Gast, which is the server brings it to the guest, and now it's a feminine it because die Apfelschorle. So now we've got a feminine accusative. Der Kellner bringt sie, feminine accusative right here, dem Gast. And then der Kellner bringt sie ihm. You can also replace both of those nouns with pronouns, and you end up with the server brings it to him. One of them, the first one is in accusative, second one's in dative. Okay, let's try some different genders. Der Kellner bringt der Frau das Mineralwasser. The server brings the woman the sparkling water. So let's replace der Frau with just a pronoun. Der Kellner bringt ihr das Mineralwasser. The server brings her the sparkling water. So ihr is our feminine dative pronoun. Der Kellner bringt es der Frau. Now we're replacing das Mineralwasser, which is neuter. It's neuter and accusative, right? So it brings it to the woman, and we can replace both. We can say the server brings it to her. Der Kellner bringt es ihr. Then they will just match with their gender and the case they need to be in based on whether it's the direct object or the indirect object. Okay, der Kellner bringt der Frau die Apfelschorle. Now both of them are feminine. And so we want to replace maybe the woman, right? Der Kellner bringt ihr die Apfelschorle, brings her, brings it to her, dative feminine pronoun. Or we could replace just the Apfelschorle, brings it to the woman. Der Kellner bringt sie der Frau. And then, of course, we could replace both. We could say, der Kellner bringt sie ihr, brings it to her. So, just to remind you, we have the endings that match between our indefinite articles and our possessives. These are called ein words. It's just because they match, right? They work the same way. And then we had these words called der words, or sometimes called diese words. And they're called that because they work the same way as the der words. The possessives work the same way as the ein words. And the der words work the same way as the other der words. So, der Apfel, you could say the apple. But then you could say dieser Apfel, meaning this apple, and see how they have that same ending. Der, dieser, same R at the end. Die Banane, diese Banane, changing from the banana to this banana. Das Auto, dieses Auto, they match that ending. Die Blumen, diese Blumen. So diese just means this, and then it has the same ending as it would on the definite article. So they work the same way as the definite articles. Their endings match the endings of the definite articles. Der, die, das, right? So that's why they're called der words, or maybe dieser words. Dieser is the most common. So note how the ending of diese matches the ending of der, die, das, right? These are the nominatives right here, but it works with every case. For example, in the accusative, den Mann becomes diesen Mann, or dem Mann in the dative becomes diesem Mann. So let's try. Der Apfel ist rot would be dieser Apfel ist rot. This apple is red. Dieser Apfel ist nicht rot. Dieser Apfel ist grün. This apple is not red. This apple is green. Diese Banane ist gelb. Diese Banane ist nicht gelb. Diese Banane ist grün. Dieses Auto ist schwarz. See that S on the end? Dieses Auto comes from das Auto. Dieses Auto. Dieses Auto ist nicht schwarz. Dieses Auto ist rot, meaning this car. Okay, and then in plural, diese Blumen sind gelb. Diese Blumen sind nicht gelb. Diese Blumen sind lila. And then we have, for example, magst du diese Wohnung? Do you like this apartment? Feminine. Ja, dieser Ausblick ist toll. That's masculine. Dieser Ausblick. Dieses Zimmer ist sehr groß. So Zimmer is neuter. This room is neuter. So dieses Zimmer, this room. Welches Zimmer ist das schönste? Welches, so we had a bunch of diese examples. Now we have welche is another one of these der words. And it takes those same endings. And then alle is one that's used for the plurals only. Alle Zimmer sind schön. All the rooms are nice. Jedes Zimmer ist schön. Each and every. So you see we've got dieses, welches, jedes. They all have that same ending. So now we have some more diese words. So alle and beide are used for plurals only. Dieser, jeder, jener, manche, solche, welche. Manche can be singular or plural. So then we've got the chart for you to review, and important to review also is that diese and jener can mean the former and the latter. And then we are going to review the prepositions now. So we use the nominative for subjects and predicate nouns. Then we use the accusative for direct objects and also prepositions that require the accusative. So what are these accusative prepositions and what are these dative prepositions that we did? Accusative prepositions, there's just a list of them that always use the accusative, right? When you see that preposition, you know that whatever comes next needs to be in the accusative. So, for example, das Geschenk ist für dich. Für is an accusative preposition. So what comes after, either a noun or a pronoun, needs to be in the accusative. Dich, accusative pronoun. So use the accusative, of course, for direct objects, but also for prepositions that require accusative. Jens und Birgit laufen durch den Wald. Durch den Wald. So you can see how that's in the accusative, through the forest. Durch den Wald. Ich fahre durch die Stadt. I drive through the city. Accusative preposition. Feminine accusative, die Stadt. Geht das Haus. He goes around the house. Is an accusative preposition. So let's review these examples. Jens und Birgit laufen durch den Wald. Durch meaning through. Durch die Stadt, through the city. Geht das Haus. So if you're talking about space, spatially it's time, or spatially it's it means around, and then for time, if you're going to say a clock time, it's at that clock time. Das Seminar beginnt 10 Uhr. The seminar begins at 10 o'clock. Für is very much like English for, and then ohne also very much like English without. Entlang means along, and it comes after the object. A couple of these prepositions come after the object. So das Paar geht die Straße entlang is the couple walks down the street, or the couple walks along the street. The couple walks the street along is literally what it says. Gegen usually means against. Sophie Scholl war gegen den Faschismus. Sophie Scholl was against fascism. But sometimes with a clock time, it means around that time. Wir treffen uns gegen 8 Uhr. We're meeting up around 8 o'clock. Okay, so then we have the song, which is, of course, durch, für, ohne, gegen, bis, entlang. Durch, für, ohne, gegen, bis, entlang. Alle nehmen Akkusativ. Durch, für, ohne, gegen, bis, entlang. So those were accusative prepositions. Now let's do dative prepositions. There's a bunch of these, right? So here is a list of dative prepositions. And we can try them out. For example, ich gehe mit meiner Freundin wandern. I go hiking with my girlfriend. Mit meiner Freundin. So mit is the dative preposition, always requires the dative. And then meiner, you can see how that's in the dative afterwards. So let's review. These are all the accusatives and the meanings, more or less, and then these are all the datives with their meanings, more or less. Accusative, or the prepositions have slippery meanings, so depending on context, they'll change their meaning. So, of course, the song to help you remember the dative prepositions is außer, bei, mit, nach, seit, von, zu. Okay, so then we sing the song again. Please sing the songs at your leisure to impress people. I sing them to my nephew. He's very impressed. Okay, so of course, nach and zu and in they all mean going to places depending on the context. So nach means after sometimes, but then related to going places, it means to. You can go to countries and cities without an article. Nach Deutschland, nach Mexico, nach Berlin, nach Paris. But then zu is when you're going to smaller places, buildings, people, houses. Zum Supermarkt, zu Disneyland, zu meinem Freund, zu mir. But you use in when you go inside of buildings or you're going to countries that use an article. Ins Kino, ins Fitnessstudio, in die Schweiz, in die USA. So I go to the US, I go to Switzerland, I go to the gym. Yeah. So it's a little tricky thing about translating that. And then by means at, near, with, depending on context. So I encourage you to review the prepositions chapter if you feel, you always have to come back to prepositions because they are very tricky things. So as you continue to translate, you will get a better feel for when a preposition means what. And seit is a very tricky one. It means since or for. It has to do with time, right? Seit wann lebt Herr Braun in Kiel? Since when does Mr. Braun live in Kiel? Which is like the most parallel translation, but it's maybe not the best translation. Since when has he been living? Or maybe for how long has he been living? Seit plus a verb in the present tense. Often the best translation in English is has been living or has lived. So it looks like you've made it past in English, but it's actually still the present because we're saying has been living or has lived. It's like it's both the past and the present. He has been doing it up until now and is still doing it. So that's a pretty tricky one with seit. And then seit Mai would mean since May. That's the easy version of seit. And then the very common question, seit wann lernst du Deutsch? Since when you're learning German, which is like the most parallel and really not the best translation. It's really asking, for how long have you been learning German? And then you can say seit einem Jahr, since 1 year, which is not right, for 1 year, yeah. Okay, and then these idiomatic expressions must be memorized as set phrases. They don't make sense. The nach and the zu, they don't make sense in this context. You just have to memorize that nach Hause means going to home. Ich fahre nach Hause, ich gehe nach Hause, ich laufe nach Hause. It's with the movement, right? But then zu Hause means no movement. Ich bin zu Hause, ich bleibe zu Hause, ich lese zu Hause. I am at home, I stay at home, I read at home, whatever it is, I do at home. So you just have to memorize that nach Hause and zu Hause are set phrases that mean different things. And then once we are comfortable with our accusative prepositions and our dative prepositions, then you want the two-way or changing prepositions that can do either, right? And the difference is, of course, with the movement. Dative has no movement, stationary. Ich bin in dem Haus. Haus is neuter, right? So we're in the dative. I am in the house, dative. But what about, this is a feminine, so stationary, dative. Ich bin in der Stadt, feminine dative. I am in the city. Dative with no movement. Ich bin in dem Wald. Wald is masculine. I am in the forest. So let's look at the difference. Ich gehe in das Haus. That one is accusative because when there is movement, you're going into the house, that is going to take the accusative. But if there is no movement, you're just in the house, then it's the dative. Ich bin in dem Haus. So in das Haus versus in dem Haus. Ich laufe in den Wald, same thing. That one is going into the forest versus ich bin in dem Wald, in the dative. Ich fahre in die Stadt. I drive into the city, accusative. Ich bin in der Stadt, in the dative. Yeah. So, of course, the list of these is an, auf, hinter, in, neben, über, unter, vor, zwischen. That's how you remember those. And so let's look at how would we even do this, right? Ich bin in dem Haus, dative. What about with the indefinite article? Hopefully you remember your dative indefinite article for neuter is einem. And then if we want to do the possessives, it would be meinem, deinem, seinem, ihrem, unserem. All of those would have that same ending. What about with the various verbs, right? So some verbs imply movement and some verbs imply stationary. So, ich stelle die Flasche auf den Tisch. Stellen, to place, it implies movement. So that's, it goes with then the accusative version because it implies movement. But stehen means to stand or just to be there, right? And so that one is going to be the dative because it implies stationary. Die Flasche steht auf dem Tisch. But what about, yeah, here we have stehen again. Das Buch steht im Bücherregal. It stands. You see how it's in dem, it's in the dative. Versus stellen, to place, implies movement. Ich stelle das Buch ins Bücherregal. That is, it implies movement, so it is then the accusative. Ich lege meine Brille neben die Lampe. Legen means to place, but in a horizontal position. So that implies movement. But then meine Brille liegt neben der Lampe. Liegen is to lie there in a horizontal position. So wohin means where to, right? Stellen, legen, hängen, where to, plus accusative with movement. Ich stelle die Weingläser auf den Tisch. I place the wine glasses onto the table. Or maybe ich lege meinen Mantel auf das Bett. These are all accusative. Ich hänge meine Jacke in den Kleiderschrank. All accusative because they all imply movement. Versus wo, which just means where, stationary. Stehen, liegen, hängen. Hängen goes for both of them. So die Weingläser stehen auf dem Tisch. Now we have dative. Mein Mantel liegt auf dem Bett. We have dative. And then meine Jacke hängt in dem Kleiderschrank. It's just hanging there by itself. It is not, there's no movement of hanging, just hanging there on its own. So now dative. So then we had all of those prepositions for the accusative and for dative. And then we also learned a few prepositions that require the genitive. So these are the advanced prepositions, the fanciest ones. Of course, ones that you will see in academic writing more often than you will hear them in speech. So please review the meanings of all of these genitive prepositions, and you will see them come up from time to time, but they'll be in the dictionary as well if you forget. Yeah. So we have some examples with genitive prepositions. Wir bleiben wegen des Wetters zu Hause. So wegen means because of, and so you see how when you have wegen, it's a genitive preposition. So what comes after the object of the preposition needs to be in the genitive. Wir bleiben wegen des Wetters zu Hause. Wir bleiben wegen der Pandemie zu Hause. So Pandemie is feminine, so it's because of the pandemic, wegen der Pandemie. What about statt seines Sohnes nahm der Vater die Tochter mit? So statt means instead of, and it's a genitive preposition, so it needs to have genitive following it, instead of his son. Statt seines Sohnes. Trotz der Gefahr, Gefahr is feminine, so in spite of the danger. Yeah. Die Mutter macht sich wegen ihres Kindes Sorgen. The mother is worrying because of her child. Wegen ihres Kindes. Because of her child. Rudi rief während der Nacht zweimal an. Während means during, or sometimes while, but in this case as a preposition, during. So during the night, während der Nacht. It's in the genitive. So I would encourage you to review the meanings of the prepositions as they occur in various contexts. So you can get so far by reading the chart and becoming familiar with these, but also it's just the sort of thing you have to acquire as you go. But it is always useful to come back to the chart and see what sort of thing you didn't notice before or that you didn't understand before that you now understand now that you have more context. It's the hermeneutic circle. You can't understand the part until you understand the whole. And you can't understand the whole until you understand the part. And you keep going in a circle until you understand better and better. Okay, So prepositions can also have contractions. Some of these are more common than others, but just familiarize yourself with these common. These ones I have on this slide are the most common ones. Zu and dem can become zum. It's optional. It's always optional, but it's very common. Bei and dem becomes beim. Zu der, zur, von dem, vom. Bei der cannot become anything; it just stays. And then von der cannot be made a contraction of either. Okay, so and then some of the prepositions actually come after their object. It's like in English, a year ago. So a few of these can do that. And so review these. If you don't remember these are some of the fancy ones. A number of prepositions are used frequently in academic texts to mean according to. For example, diesem Buch gemäß, laut diesem Buch nach, diesem Buch zufolge. Those all mean according to. So it's worth committing those to memory more or less because you'll see those a lot. And then here's another pronoun. Man means one, they, you, or someone. It's sort of an indefinite pronoun. So note the difference between der Mann and Mann, right? Der Mann refers to a specific male person. It's a noun. Mann refers to a person of any gender in a non-specific way. It's a pronoun. So Mann can be rendered into English with one, you, someone, or they, depending on the context. So you could say, Man trägt Sandalen im Sommer. One wears sandals in the summer, or you wear sandals in the summer, or whatever it is, depending on context. But it's not any specific person. It's just sandals are worn. People wear sandals, right? Man trägt Handschuhe im Winter. One wears gloves in the winter. Man isst, was man isst. You are what you eat, or one is what one eats. In Hessen trinkt man Apfelwein. In Hesse, they drink apple cider, or maybe one drinks apple cider. It's customary. In Berlin isst man Currywurst. It's customary. In Berlin, they eat Currywurst. One eats Currywurst. So they're indefinite pronouns. Man and then jemand means someone, and niemand means no one. And so those are important little indefinite pronouns to note. Here I have the adjective endings. We're not going to review adjective endings as such, but they go along with the nouns, right? Since we're reviewing nouns and pronouns, I wanted to put this chart in here to remind you to review these if you don't remember them. It's not, you don't have to memorize every single little ending. I would just invite you to really review the ones with no article, because when there's no article, sometimes it's that adjective ending that is telling you what case the noun is in. So for example, the genitive with no article, roter Socken. So when there's no article, it's only that adjective ending that's telling you that it's in the genitive. And of course, if it's in the genitive, you'll need to translate it as a genitive, meaning add the possessive, add the of the, or maybe an apostrophe s. So that will be, the genitive ones without articles are worth memorizing because it really makes a difference in how you translate it. And sometimes, especially in the plural, there's not going to be an article. So it's only the adjective ending that will tell you it's in the genitive. Okay, and then I wanted to just point to these very quickly. These adjectives used as nouns because we're talking about nouns, right? And so sometimes you can get an adjective and turn that into a noun. And so when that happens, you have all those same adjective endings, like der Alte, ein Alter, the old man, an old man, and see how they have the same adjective endings they would normally have, like der Grüne, ein Grüner. That's also what's happening. Der Alte, ein Alter. So just so you can recognize that those are actually nouns, but they have adjective endings because they're nouns that have been made out of adjectives. And then one other thing that you can do to make a noun is you can use an infinitive, a verb infinitive to make a noun. And this is very common. You just take the verb infinitive, which is like the en at the end, right? And then you capitalize it, and then it becomes a neuter noun. Das Denken, the thinking. Das Singen, the singing. Das Rauchen, the smoking, right? You can do that with any verb. So we had then, I wanted to review the relative clauses at the end as well because we're talking about nouns and pronouns, and relative clauses start with relative pronouns. So when we review pronouns, relative pronouns is part of that, right? So let's look at the relative clauses again. Die Bäckerin ist eine Frau. Sie bäckt Brot. We can have these two sentences. They're two short sentences. Or we can combine them to have a main clause plus a relative clause. Die Bäckerin ist eine Frau, die Brot bäckt. And in that case, we're going to use a relative pronoun, die, to refer back to eine Frau. And that's how we get the relative clause. Der Bäcker ist ein Mann, bäckt Brot, versus, we're going to make it into a relative clause. Der Bäcker ist ein Mann, der Brot bäckt. We're using a relative pronoun. And now we're going to fill in the relative pronoun. Eine Köchin ist eine Frau, die in einer Küche arbeitet. That's a relative pronoun. Ein Koch ist ein Mann, der in einer Küche arbeitet. We need a relative pronoun to refer back to ein Mann, right? And then ein Komponist ist ein Mann, der Musik komponiert. Eine Komponistin ist eine Frau, die Musik komponiert. So we start our relative clause with the relative pronoun, which is der or die in this case, and then we end the relative clause with the verb, because it's a verb kicker. So the main clause has normal word order. Ein Bäcker ist ein Mann. The relative clause starts with the relative pronoun, der Brot und Brötchen bäckt, and ends with the verb. The verb is kicked to the end. So we will review word order. And so in the video with the word order review, we'll talk about verb kickers in more detail. But for now, just to remind you that that verb is at the end because of that. Eine Köchin ist eine Frau, die in einer Küche arbeitet. So die is the relative pronoun, and then the verb's at the end. So those were all in the nominative, but we can have a relative pronouns in all the different cases, right? So the relative pronoun will change its case based on whether it's the subject, direct object, or indirect object. So you can think of them as two separate sentences, right? Ein Kellner ist ein Mann. That's the main clause. And the relative clause, der im Restaurant das Essen serviert. It's like it's its own little sentence, right? But it's a dependent clause, so it's not like a full sentence, but it's kind of like a little sentence because it has all the elements of the sentence, right? It's got the subject, it's got a verb, it's got a direct object. The subject is actually the relative pronoun. So if you took it back to like a regular sentence, it would be serviert das Essen im Restaurant. So you see that's a subject, right? So the subject is then the relative pronoun, and then that's why it's in the nominative, right? So we can say same thing when you have the relative pronoun as a subject, so of course it's the nominative, right? Or here's a feminine one. Eine Ärztin ist eine Frau, die im Krankenhaus arbeitet. That's the subject. Die im Krankenhaus arbeitet. If it were a normal sentence, it would be sie arbeitet im Krankenhaus, and that's a subject, right? So that's why the relative pronouns in the nominative. So here are relative pronouns. You can see we got nominative ones, accusative ones, and dative ones. There are also genitive ones that we'll see in the last chart. And you compare, they look just like the articles, right? So der Mann, der, die Frau, der, die, das, die, those look like the definite articles. And so they match the definite articles in all the cases except for dative plural. In dative plural, you would have den Kindern, so den, but the relative pronoun is not den, it's denen. So the dative plural is the only case where the relative pronoun is different from the article. Okay, so let's look at some accusative ones. Das ist der Mantel. Ich kaufe den Mantel. I'm buying the coat. So now you see we want to have a relative pronoun, but as the direct object. So that will be the accusative. Das ist der Mantel, den ich kaufe. The coat that I'm buying. It's the direct object. Like, ich kaufe den Mantel. Ich kaufe den, right? So that is the direct object and the accusative. Das ist das Buch. Ich lese das Buch. Same thing. Das ist das Buch, das ich lese. The book that I'm reading. I'm reading the book. It's a direct object. So, wir kaufen das Brot, das schon 2 Tage alt ist. We're buying the bread that is already 2 days old. It's like the bread is already 2 days old. It's a subject, it's a nominative. Der Job, den ich möchte, ist interessant. The job that I would like is interesting. So I would like the job, right? It's the direct object, it's in the accusative. Kennst du die Studentin, die Katja heißt? That one's in the nominative. Do you know the student who is named Katja? It's like sie heißt Katja, right? So die heißt Katja, nominative. Now let's look at some of the dative. Das ist der Mann, ich gebe dem Mann das Buch. This is the man, I give the man the book. But what if we want to say, this is the man to whom I give the book? Now we need our relative pronoun in the dative because that relative pronoun is acting as the indirect object. I give the book to whom? To the man, right? So, dem, and you could also say, this is the man who I give the book to. Das ist die Frau, ich gebe der Frau das Buch, same thing, but with feminine. Das ist die Frau, der ich das Buch gebe. This is the woman to whom I give the book. So der is going to be our feminine dative relative pronoun. Or you could also say, this is the woman who I give the book to, either way. Der Mann heißt Klaus, ich gebe dem Mann das Buch. Same thing, but we're just going to have our relative clause sort of in the middle of our main clause, which you can do. Der Mann, dem ich das Buch gebe, heißt Klaus. The reason we do this is because we want to have a relative clause as close as possible to the noun that it's describing, right? The man to whom I give the book. Like the man, well, what man? We want more information about this man. The man to whom I give the book. They go together, right? And then we can continue on with the rest of the sentence. Die Frau heißt Birgit, ich gebe der Frau das Buch. Die Frau, der ich das Buch gebe, heißt Birgit. Same sentence, but with a feminine. The woman to whom I give the book is named Birgit. Now let's try with a neuter. Das Kind heißt Hannes. Ich gebe dem Kind das Buch. So we're going to use our neuter dative relative pronoun. Das Kind, dem ich das Buch gebe, heißt Hannes. The child to whom I give the book is named Hannes. And then now let's do a plural. This is the trickiest one. Die Kinder heißen Hannes und Jutta. Ich gebe den Kindern das Buch. Now I want to say the children to whom I give the book. Die Kinder, denen ich das Buch gebe. So now we're going to see we need that relative pronoun, the dative plural, which is denen, which is different from the article that we had on the full noun. Okay, so here is a review of the relative pronouns. Hopefully they're recognizable to you. And then we will, when we review verb tenses in the next review video, we will do this again. But I just wanted to point out quickly that it looks a little different when you do it in the past tense with our relative clauses, right? So you start the relative clause with the relative pronoun and the conjugated verb goes to the end. Participle goes second to last. So I had these sentences. Das sind die Haferflocken. Ich habe die Haferflocken gegessen. And then I wanted to combine them to a relative clause. So das sind die Haferflocken, die ich gegessen habe. This is the oatmeal that I ate. These are the oat flakes that I eat and have. But see how we're replacing Haferflocken with the relative pronoun. It's a plural, die. And then here we have these again. Das ist das Kind, dem ich $1 geschenkt habe. So to whom, right? What's the role of dem? It's the indirect object. You could replace it with the full noun, dem Kind, right? Just to show you next to the chart. And then to show you the plural again. Das sind die Kinder, denen ich $10 geschenkt habe. These are the children to whom. So the reason we have denen here is because we want our plural dative indirect object sort of relative pronoun. So it's the indirect object. If you had the full noun, it would be den Kindern. But as a relative pronoun, it's just denen. Okay, so now we use the nominative for subjects and direct objects. And the dative, nominative for subjects, accusative for direct objects, dative for indirect objects. What do we also use the accusative and dative for? Prepositions that require either accusative or dative. So to review all these, make sure that you can sing the songs so you know which is which, and it will give you information when you translate. And then the reason we're reviewing prepositions right now is because you can also do relative pronouns with prepositions. And when you do that, you need to know what noun case goes along with that preposition, because that will help you choose the correct relative pronoun, right? Ich habe 800 € für den Computer bezahlt. Das ist der Computer, für den ich 800 € bezahlt habe. This is the computer for which I paid 800 euros. Or this is the computer that I paid 800 euros for. So you have to know what to do with that relative pronoun. When you translate it, you have to know, like, für den looks like sort of for the or something. If you don't know that's a relative pronoun, it looks like an article. So that's why it's important to understand how these relative clauses work, especially with the prepositions, which are the trickiest ones. Das ist mein neuer Kollege. Ich arbeite jeden Tag mit dem Kollegen. So, das ist mein neuer Kollege, mit dem ich jeden Tag arbeite. This is my new colleague with whom I work every day, mit dem. Or maybe that I work every day with. And so mit is always going to be dative, so that's why it's mit dem. Das sind die Leute. Ich möchte mit den Leuten sprechen. These are the people. I would like to speak with the people. Das sind die Leute, mit denen ich sprechen möchte. These are the people with whom I would like to speak. Or these are the people that I would like to speak with. So mit is always going to be dative, and we want our plural dative relative pronoun, which is denen. And then when you have a combination, we have these phrasal verbs, right? A verb plus a preposition that always goes with it. They just go together. To wait for is warten auf plus accusative. So when you do this, you can do it also with relative clauses, right? So you say, das ist der Bus, ich warte auf den Bus. This is the bus. I'm waiting for the bus. But you could also say, das ist der Bus, auf den ich warte. This is the bus for which I am waiting. So you got your preposition. You're going to start the relative clause with that. And then you're going to choose the relative pronoun based on whatever case it needs to be in. Or you can say, this is the bus that I'm waiting for. Das ist der Mann. Ich denke an den Mann. An den Mann. So denken an means think of or think about. You can say, das ist der Mann, an den ich denke. The man of which I'm thinking, or the man that I'm thinking of. So there's lots of verbs that have the same sort of pattern, and they can all do things like this. So here is the chart with the relative pronouns again, but this one actually has the genitive as well. So dessen and deren. These would be like whose, like the woman whose child is here or something. That would be die Frau, deren Kind hier ist. So whose. You could start your relative clause with whose, and that would be either dessen or deren. Okay, so we just did this pretty recently. This was the last couple of chapters with the da compounds. We learned da compounds, right? So when you want to say inanimate objects with it, for it, you have to use a da compound, davon. So hopefully, since this wasn't that long ago, it won't have become that fuzzy. But I put the slides in here just in case you want to review, but I'm not going to go over the da compounds in more detail because it was just a few days ago. And if you would like to review the da compounds, you can go back to just 2 chapters ago and watch that video again. The vowel compounds is the same thing. It's very recent. So I put these slides in here in case you want to just go through and refresh the da and vowel compounds so that you have those fresh in your mind as well. And then we have these exercises. So these exercises are going to test your mastery in a variety of noun and pronoun situations. So this one has a bunch of nouns and pronouns, and so translate the sentence and then note, when you see a noun or a pronoun, note what the case is. Is it the nominative? Is it the accusative? Is it the dative? Is it the genitive? And so we're going to have several dialogues and several sets of sentences. Here's a fun little story. And then a couple more little dialogues. And this is just a little story. And they all have nouns and pronouns, and they will test out how well you have been able to deal with translating nouns and pronouns. So please do all the above exercises, and we'll go over the answers together in class on Zoom. And also on this PowerPoint, after a few blank slides, there are the answers for your reference. So bis bald, wir sehen uns im Unterricht. Vielen Dank. Tschüss.